We're going to be talking today about SAT versus ACT. My name is Tal Kitron. I work with Applerouth and I have for about a decade. I've done it in a few different capacities, but right now I work as an online premium tutor. So mostly PSAT, SAT, ACT, just via Zoom, working with hour or 90-minute sessions. And so this is really my bread and butter. And so I'm excited to compare these two tests, show you guys how much overlap they have, and also some key differences. As questions come up, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. It's a lot of slides to get through, but I'm aiming to leave some time at the end for questions and answers, and I'll make sure that we get out of here in an hour today. Without further ado, let's get started. We're going to cover the formats of the test. We'll cover content as well as major strategies. Hard to do everything in an hour, but I'll certainly share my guidance from years of testing experience and kind of some things that will stick out and help everyone. And techniques you can immediately apply to a real test or to a practice test, which is often the first step of SAT, ACT, is take practice tests to see which one is a better fit for you. First up's the SAT. The gold standard for most of the SAT's existence has been a 1600 as a perfect score. For a while, it went to 2400 and was kind of a strange test, but now it's back. 4 total sections. The first is reading, then writing, which is grammar, rhetoric, then a short math no calc section, and then a longer one with calculator. The way that it works is the reading and writing together, the first 2 sections are worth 800. So that's 400 points total available on section 1, very long reading section, and then an equal amount on the shorter writing section. For math, it's 800 total. There's 58 total questions, and it's graded on a curve. So this whole test is standardized, meaning that SAT and ACT are graded on a curve compared with everyone else who takes that same test on that same day. On PSAT, which we're not going to talk about too much, just know that the verbal is counted double. The PSAT is not very important for a vast majority of people, but if you're a super duper high scorer, in October of every year, the PSAT is offered. You can get some scholarships and feathers in the cap from that. But on the PSAT only, the reading counts double the verbal scores. But SAT, you got reading, writing, math, and math. Some things we're going to talk about really do apply to all 4 sections of the test. And I want to just remind you that everyone's different, especially on the reading section. So a lot of what I work on in tutoring is what fits your skills? Which passage types do we like or dislike? And what question types do we like or dislike? But throughout the test, something that almost everyone can benefit from for as long as it's a hard copy, not a digital test, which is what the SAT is now. You've got a test booklet and a Scantron sheet to bubble in. Everything should be done in the test booklet generally. So whether it's reading, writing, or math, you should be marking up the passage, which we'll look at in a moment, looking at punctuation on writing, circling what you're solving for in math, showing work. So it's very reading heavy. You want to actively paraphrase and write stuff in the margins. That's crucial. Moving with the pencil also keeps people alert. So if you're one who tends to lose focus, I think moving the pencil and actively reading throughout will help a lot with that. And then as opposed to other iterations of the SAT in the past, there is no guessing penalty. So leave nothing blank. If you do run out of time, what I tell people is bubble straight down, C, or B. There is no evidence that one answer is more correct more often. But mathematically, strategically, you should bubble in straight down if you have run guessing, or if you run out of time and guess. Go straight down, because if you Christmas tree it and go A, B, C, D, C, B, A, you're likely to miss them all. If you go straight down, you're going to get 1 in 4 on average correct, maybe more. So it makes sense to always put an answer in, but you shouldn't just bubble in randomly. You should go straight down in a time crunch. These are just good test taking strategies, really, for both tests. Section 1 of the SAT, in my opinion, is usually the hardest for a vast majority of students. It's reading. 65 minutes for 52 questions, which leaves us with an average of 75 seconds per question. I've seen a couple good Q&As already, so keep them coming. I'll answer them at the end. It's the longest section. So again, the calculator section, math, section 4 is similar, 55 minutes, but this one is 65 minutes to start. And the very first thing is a literature passage, which sometimes is like 1800 or 1840. That can be really intimidating. So one thing to remember is you don't have to go in order. If you don't like the literature passage, but you do well with science or fact-based, maybe we start at passage 3 or 5. So that's one thing that people can do is move around on passages, but also questions, right? We don't have to go in order on anything. We can pick and choose. The main goal in reading is prioritize easy points so that you make sure you get to everything. If we do run out of time, we always want it to be on the hardest stuff so that we can just guess. We might have missed it anyway. Unlike the ACT, the SAT has some pretty dense passages, so just be aware that that could happen. The general rule there would be zoom out as much as you can and try to just get main ideas, so you don't want to read and reread and reread again, because we don't have time for it. The passage types, literary narrative is always passage 1, no exception, so it's the first thing you'll see on test day, and it's usually like 2 pages out of a novel, and I've heard students say, well, nothing happened. It was super boring. Nothing happened. I don't know. I don't like it. And we have to come to grips with the fact that probably nothing will happen. It's 2 pages out of a Jane Austen book. Nothing's going to happen. They're going to develop some characters, and we're going to learn about feelings and relationships. That's passage 1. Passage 2 is almost always social sciences versus passage 4, which is history or politics. Very different and much harder. So I don't know that I would group these exactly like this, but passages 2 and 4 are going to be a little bit more historical, with one being fact-based and one being like 2 pages out of a book in 1800 about slavery or civil rights or women's rights. So politics and literature tend to be the toughest 2. And then passages 3 and 5 are always natural science, no exceptions. And that's very fact-based, lends itself to a faster read, lots of little notes. Sometimes people like these better. You're definitely going to see graphs and charts on the SAT reading and writing. There is no science section in SAT, which we'll look at it when we get to the ACT later, but they do mix in graphs and charts and describing data throughout the tests. So expect to see those. And for those, you're going to be really robotic. You just want to look at the y-axis, the x-axis, and not think too hard. We'll just look at every choice and be very careful. This would be another example of a graph we could see. So active reading really in some form or another helps almost everyone. I'm not as big as some tutors on circling and starring and underlining. While I think it's important, I think that taking notes is the most important, because if you read one paragraph and take an obvious note, it seems not necessary. But then you read 10 more paragraphs and you got to do questions. We need a little bit of paraphrased notes just to remember what happened. So if you can write like a little outline and just put things in your own words as you go, it often speeds people up, ironically, and helps them on the questions. What are we underlining? So I'd say to do is stay alert and awake. I don't care what we underline, but names, places, key events make sense. Whatever it is that will help you stay alert or awake throughout. Transition words and names can be circled. Main ideas can be starred instead of underlining the whole thing. But again, I wouldn't call it annotating, because that sounds scary when people do it in school. I would make short notes by each paragraph and make it as simple as possible. So like really, really simple. Good, bad, arrows, smiley faces, frowny faces. Nobody will ever see it but you. So it's just a tool that you can then use when you're on the questions looking back and forth. So what does that look like? Let me show you. Look. What I say it looks like is underlining 30 to 40% of the passage. So cultural, environmental factors, influence, how superstitious an individual is. I might circle, for example, here. If we're losing control, tend to become more superstitious. I'm not going to really come back and look that much at what I underlined. So what's really going to be helpful here is I put like cultural and end factors affect superstition. and however you want to write that, right? Superstition or just whatever is enough to put in the margin. I think, again, the key here is finding your comfort zone. So everyone's different. Some people really don't have time to do this and it doesn't help them. But for most, it allows us to move through the passage on the surface, take simple notes so that when you're at the questions, you have a lifeline and you can move much more quickly and make matches that feel more definite. So that's something I work on a lot with students. And again, it's just kind of trying to find the comfort zone and collaborate to find that. This is an open book test, meaning that you've got the passage and then 2 questions or 10 questions per passage. And so we got with these is question and choices. I always tell my students, think like the test writers. A writer, I picture basement dwellers, they just write test questions all day, every day. And they're gonna write a question and then a correct answer, and then 3 choices meant to fool people like you and me. So our job is actually go in and think, okay, they're more likely to carry a lucky charm than other people in order to support what? So we paraphrase the question and then we find bad answers. So like supernatural, wait a second, we're not talking about like X-Men here. And then individuals and groups, I don't remember them comparing individuals and groups, so maybe that would be wrong. And then I think they said everyone shows some level of superstition. I remember that first line being about environmental factors impact. So we can go back and forth. The better your notes, the more easy that will become. The other really big difference is the evidence-based paired questions. So that is something that does not exist on ACT reading. All the other strategies we've talked about pretty much apply. So active reading, you want to use answer choices to find bad words. But these EBQ questions are very, very different. They look like this on the right. If you've ever taken a PSAT, which I guess everyone has, or an SAT, you know this, you've seen these. And our strategy for this is a little bit interesting. I was skeptical when we first introduced it, but the general rule is you want to block out the answers to the first question, use the first question to find the lines that address it, and then use those lines to come back and answer the first question. The idea being, if you pick an answer here, you're often going to pigeonhole yourself into an answer on 2, and sometimes you'll miss them both. So you don't want to limit yourself on the lines. You want to find the lines that address this and then come back and answer question 1 based on just a few lines. This is 40% of SAT reading questions, so really a lot of stuff here. And I do think it's something that some people very much struggle with at the outset. So EBQ pairs is a big difference. And if you don't love them, that's 1 point in favor of ACT. ACT doesn't have them. Critical and careful reading, you're always going to get rewarded for that, but I do think that's especially true on EBQs. So just kind of to illustrate how that works. The second question on EBQs, and the first thing you should do when they say 65 minutes, 52 questions, reading section begins now. First thing you do is go straight down every passage, all 52 questions, and circle all the ones that are paired. So you know they're different. And so you can use those line references in the second question to find your evidence. And then we use that to match back to the first. So they're just using the second and then opening up the first to show the strategy as it exists on the test. Lines and then back to answer. So how does that look? Again, Madison states the Republic can. And so then I look at the lines. B looks good because it says something about a republic. But we go back to each of those lines, decide, nope, that doesn't talk about Madison's view of a republic, or maybe yes, this does. And then we come back and answer 32. So this is something on SAT reading that's pretty helpful and very different. And those who don't have SAT prep, I think will be at a disadvantage to those who have had good prep. Last thing on SAT reading is there's a comparison passage. We just don't know which it will be. So even though it usually goes literature, social science, natural science, politics, natural science, one of those 5 will be a paired passage. So passage A, passage B, and then some questions about each. And although the questions will be mixed up, it usually does go in order. So it's usually passage A and then a few passage A questions, which is why you should do it that way. On comparison passages, do not read both passage A and B. First read passage A and do those questions, then read passage B and do those questions and the ones that compare. There's a couple reasons for that. The main one just being you want to keep less in your mind at one time. So you'll separate those. And then as you read passage B, you're thinking in your head, how does this relate back to passage A? And then the last few questions would be like, what if these authors were to meet in a bar? Would they be shaking hands and hugging? Would they be just kind of not friends but not enemies, or would they be battling each other? And then the answer choices will often gear you towards one of those relationships. Step 1, read the first passage for these. Step 2, answer those questions that relate only to passage A. Then read passage B with notes, and then answer the others. And again, that's just one of the 5. We don't know which ever. So it could be the very first thing you see or the last or somewhere in between on reading. Next up is SAT writing. This is the section that has by far the most overlap with ACT. It's almost identical, so we'll be able to fly through that when we get there. 35 minutes, 44 questions, gives you an average of 48 seconds per question. Seems like not much, but grammar and rhetoric, some of these grammar questions are super quick. Most people do not struggle for time on this section, I will say. Reading, yes, sometimes math, but not this section too much. And the general strategy that I tell people to use is you don't really need to read this. Unlike reading where you want to read and make notes, here you don't really go left to right. You kind of go right to left. Where like number 6 is a grammar question. There's no question attached. But 7 and 8 are both rhetoric. We'll talk a bit about what those differences are, but really it's just going right to left. For 7, I might need to read up and down a little bit, but then I can just move on and do 8, where I read up and down a little bit. You can just kind of go as we progress through questions, we're going right, left, right, left. And the big thing throughout all this is using those answer choices to full advantage. I think that's what students often don't do, is realize just how beneficial these choices are. Remember, the basement dweller test writers, they're predictable. They do the same thing every single time. We can use that to our advantage. Let's talk grammar. On the left, you see 3 grammar questions. And just by looking at what's underlined in the answers, we can actually tell what they're testing. Which, like, 1 is testing punctuation. 2 is also testing punctuation. And then 3 is either testing redundancy or clauses. But whenever you see D, delete, it is usually correct. I would say at least 60% of the time, if not more. The number 1 rule on grammar for SAT is when in doubt, cut it out. That means if you can get away without a punctuation mark or comma, we will. And if we can have fewer words, we'll take that. I know this is kind of hard to see, but 1 here should be A because it's a little list. So just need commas. 2 would be C, as in C with a dash, because there's a dash after also present. So that's just how hyphens work. And that's something a lot of students are not super comfortable with coming in. And then 3, life is the subject, abounds is the verb. So I don't want anything between it. Life abounds, delete. And so what are we seeing here? On this page, just punctuation and clauses, but these are all the different types of grammar topics you should expect to see. Who versus whom, I versus me, subject verb agreement, prepositions, like would you say the right of voting or the right to vote, independent and dependent clauses, all sorts of stuff. Vocab. Vocab is de-emphasized on recent versions of SAT and ACT. There are still vocab questions, but it's not as important. So it's not like we do flashcards really anymore as a major way of preparation. It still helps and still is good to be a reader, but vocab is less important these days. And one of the first things that I always go over is just punctuation rules. So like it was one of the first sessions. Commas separate related ideas. You can't separate 2 sentences. It can separate out things in a list or dependent, independent. So you have to really know those rules well, not just trusting your ear, but using that as a second resort. And first, just relying on rules. Here's some of those rules. So many people don't learn that well, so I'm just gonna leave this up for a moment. what you see with the comma, this is not exhaustive because I think commas are the hardest, but the general rule is separate related ideas. But one thing they do is they separate dependence and independence. When I got hungry, not a full sentence, I made a sandwich, full sentence. And then they don't test Oxford commas, so if anyone's thinking about that, don't. Independent clauses, a big thing here would be that periods and semicolons are identical. So like, yes, there are some nuances, but on the test, if you saw a period in choice B and a semicolon in choice C and nothing else changed, then they're both wrong because they're both periods. They can't both be right. So a semicolon is a period on this test. And then a colon, people usually think about lists, but you should think of the 2 dots as a drum roll, please, introduction. Got to have a full sentence before it, but then the colon introduces what's coming next. I had one great passion in life, drum roll, please, what was it? Making pizzas. So those would be important rules to know and just review and revisit. Some clause questions like we saw earlier, you see that right here. So like, I look at number 9 and I'd be testing choice D first because it's a semicolon and it's a terrible answer because is carbon. And honestly, if you see there that pausing is bad, we would know the answer is A for number 9. Another crucial element in soil is carbon. Done. For number 10, it's even easier. A and B are identical. So they're both wrong. 100%, no doubt, A and B are identical. They are both wrong. That usually means C would work because a comma there. And the reason that's right is because D is a comma splice. D changes the second clause into independent. So it would be independent, comma independent, and therefore no good. C, independent, comma dependent, we like. And then finally for 11, we see a dash again. So you got to just see, is there another dash? I wonder. And there is after material. If you take all that stuff out, we want the last word to be which, not they. We wouldn't say they contains. It's organic material which contains. So these answers are 9A, 10C, and 11B, but we can really get there by process of elimination on every count. Then the other part about writing is rhetorical skills. These tend to be the hardest for people when they start and then end up the easiest after tutoring. So this is more just going to be, we've got a job to do. Maybe we have to combine 2 sentences into one. Maybe we have to place a sentence somewhere or reorder a paragraph or a passage. Sometimes they ask you, should we add this information or delete it? And you got to decide yes or no and why. This is a really typical accomplish a task question, so rhetoric. This is more like ACT, just to preview that test, because the job is super simple and direct. Our job is the writer wants to provide specific information about her brother's hobbies. That's what we'd underline, and no matter what's the passage, look at what's underlined here and the choices, and we just want the one that says the most specific info about her brother's hobbies. Unlike grammar where short answers are better, this does not matter anymore. You're just a word matching robot on these questions. And so it's definitely B. Oh, Legos, Lincoln Log, that's specific hobbies. So B without a shadow of a doubt on this question. And that careful reading and circling what you're solving for is the key to all of this. You can see that's what you highlight, and then that leads us to B. All right, getting into SAT math. A lot of what we covered on English and reading will kind of apply on ACT, so we'll be able to kind of fly through a lot of it. The deal with SAT math is 3 main categories, a lot of algebra. This stuff is still mostly algebra. We just call it something kind of different. And then stats and arithmetic type of stuff. Not high-level statistics, but mean, median, mode, every once in a blue moon, standard deviation, range, and stuff like that. People haven't usually learned that well, but it's simpler when they test it. So it's usually on the calculator section, and we would never need a calculator for most of it. We've also got questions on geometry, although not that much, trig, and then they always give you this formula sheet. So at the beginning of the SAT math section, both of them, they always have this. So if you ever just have in your memory, like, okay, Or let's say you see a question, you're like, I know they're testing area, or I know they're testing the special right triangle. You don't have to know the formula here, you just have to know that it's a thing. You go back and find it. Ironically, that does not exist on the ACT, which tests geometry much, much more than SAT does. A couple of examples, we're not going to do them just in the interest of saving time, but SAT has a lot of word problems. These questions are really wordy, and my recommendation on both would probably be to plug in numbers and make it more real. But yeah, you can definitely see a ton of word problems from the beginning to the end of the section. This would be a number 4 and a number 20. So really all throughout. What's our strategy? So read carefully. I always say circle what you're solving for. That's the first step. You also want to translate words into math as best we can. You always want to show your work. I'm sure every math teacher ever has told you that. On the calculator section, of course, you can use a graphing calculator and should. And there are a lot of things you can do in that people aren't really aware of, like matrices and log base and all this stuff you can do on a calculator. And then I don't know about check your answer. So I have mixed feelings because it's such a fast-paced test that I would say if you have time to check your answers, great. But generally the job is do that at the end. So like go through everything as fast as you can. And if you've got time at the end, go back and look a little more. So sure, make sure it's not extraneous plug in, but we don't have time to check all our answers. And the other thing I'll say about SAT math is besides what we're solving for, you always want to think about what did they give me? What do I already know? Because all the clues are the same for everyone taking this test. A lot of times being able to solve is less important than just being able to make an equation or interpret part of the equation. So like in 12 here, they're not asking you to do much math. They're saying which of the following defines that function. And you've got all these X, Y points. A lot of people who've taken pre-calc or calculus or even algebra 2 will start thinking too deeply and make this harder than it needs to be. But instead, what we would look at is just what are the zeros, right? All of them, except for A, have the right zeros. X plus 5 would get you -5, 0. And X minus 2 would get you 2, 0. But B doesn't have the 0, 0, so it would have to be C or D. And that's when you would plug in another point, like maybe 1, 6, to see which one is true. So it's keeping it pretty simple, not doing hard math, plugging in points. The mathy way to do this would be thinking about whether it's an even or odd function and looking at degrees, but I really don't think that's the best way. So I tell students, anytime you're working really hard or thinking hard in this test, stop and find the shortcut, which is not a great life lesson at all. I tell them that too, but it very much is a good lesson on the SAT and ACT. Stay on the surface, find the shortcut. No calc. Section 3, 25 minutes for 20 questions. On average, that is 75 seconds per question, and we've seen the formulas. Here's an example of a question. Number 1, which is supposed to be easy. They get harder as they go. So my general rule is 1 through 8, do those. If it gets hard or when it gets hard, skip to the grid-ins. That's 16 through 20, 5 grid-in or free response questions. They reset in difficulty, and you can't really guess on those. So you have to get to the grid-ins. You have to get to 16 through 20. Because if you want to run out of time, you want it to be on 11 to 15, the hardest questions where we could guess on have a 1 in 4 shot. The answer number 1 is C, because anything squared is 0 or bigger. So there's no way that Y could be anything less than 0. So it's going to be always bigger than -1 and -2. And you can plug in numbers to prove it. Like if X was 3, Y would be 0. So B and D aren't true. And if X was 50, then A would not be true. This question is actually tricky for a lot of people, but if you pick numbers and plug in, it's easy. On the no calc section, you'll often find yourself wishing you had a calculator versus on a calculator, you'll think, oh man, I don't need this. But you need to be able to really use algebra and kind of fluently go back and forth between factoring, foiling, words, math. The nice thing though is it is very much focused on like the heart of algebra. So like this would be an example. What is being asked? Now there's a mega shortcut for this one, which is the sum of solutions in standard form is always -b over a. So it's just b, 6. The reason behind that is because of the quadratic formula. Like That's just a super shortcut that if people were math experts and really got good at SAT, they could just do that in 2 seconds. Oh, it's just B, it's 6, -6 over A. But the real math here would be, okay, this looks like a factorable thing. We can write it out. This does factor, x minus 9, x plus 3. We've confirmed our solutions are +9 and -3, values of x that would make y 0. So x intercepts, that's why this is intercept form. And then the sum of those two is 6. 9 plus -3 is 6. So multiple ways to do most problems, but there's usually a super shortcut. Here, and again, I'm going to move kind of quickly through these. We'll come back to them if we have time. But here it's just don't solve for only x. We'd have to cross multiply to solve for x. And that's an answer choice, C, but it's not our answer because we want 24 over 4, which is 6. A lot of people do the right math and pick C here because we're so used to solving for x and just circling it. Fractions is something like punctuation. A lot of people tend to need a review on early on. Last on math is the calculator section, 55 minutes, 38 questions, average of almost 1.5 minutes per question. Another formula sheet at the beginning. The first 30 are multiple choice, the last 8 are grid-ins. So I tell people do the first 15 or 16 until it gets hard, and at that point, skip to the grid-ins. Make sure you get to them. Do 31 to 38. They reset in difficulty, and we cannot guess on them. If we run out of time, we want it to be on 16 through 30, which are the toughest multiple choice questions. This would be an example of a calculator section question that doesn't really ask you to plug anything in, but I still think you should. Like if this is asking kind of a horrifying stat of how many burgers are eaten per second in the US. But if I pick like M minutes being 1 minute, there's 60 seconds in a minute, so I know that whatever's happening will happen 60 more times per minute. So even though people want to pick A or B, the answer here is just C, because in 1 minute, this 45% of 1500 would happen 60 times. So 3 is C, there's no real math to do, it's just about fluidity and fluency with this section. It's called modeling. There's basic modeling, exponential, and quadratic. And honestly, for all of them, the right move is usually identify and then pick 0 and 1 for the variable, the x, to see what happens. In 0 minutes, we should have 0 burgers. That is true for most of these answers, but not D. And in 1 minute, we should have 0.45 times 1500 times 60. This is exponential modeling. All we got to do is model our relationships and no calculator needed. Translate words into math. So they're saying 700,000 going up by 19% every 3 years. That means we're going up 100% plus 19% is 119% in parentheses. A and B show a decrease of 19%, so those are bad. And then a lot of people will pick D, but again, if you plug in X as 1 or 3, you'll see that the one that gets you a 19% increase in 3 years, 19% increase in 3 years is C. D says it happens 3 times per year. It's a bit confusing. So this would be one of a bunch of things on SAT math that we would just have to flesh out, practice, and do 3 or 4 times to really cement. Math teachers often think, oh yeah, we've done it, we're good, but that's just not how it really ever works. Repeat, see it again a week later, and then 3 weeks later, and then it's in the bank forever. Here's a word problem. This is a changing probability question. Again, I wish we had more time to look at it, but I want to make sure we get deeply into ACT. So here it would be a proportion question. I think a lot of these tests are setting up proportions and cross multiplying. So here it would be like what, 80 out of 4, or 80 out of X would be 20 out of 100, right? Or 80 over X equals 0.2, or 0.2X equals 80. And any of those we can then use to figure out how many total animals and then subtract the cows. And also we're not asked how many chickens there are, but how many more he bought. So it's 160 because we subtract the 160 already there. Now, if you think this is a little bit confusing now, just imagine if this was the last thing you saw on a 3-hour test and you were tired. So what it comes down to in the end is how rested and healthy you are on test day, right? That's going to be a big thing because this is more of a test of effort than it is of intelligence. You got to know what's on the test, but it's really just how much effort can you put into practicing. Any questions on ACT or an SAT, just kind of bank them for later, and we will get to that. We're going to talk about ACT for about 15-ish minutes. A lot of similarities. I'd say 80% of these tests have overlap. Colleges don't prefer one over the other. So no matter like whichever score you feel better about, that's what you should submit if you're submitting test scores. Some schools, some states require you to take ACT. Like I grew up in Illinois, and that was an ACT state. So I took both, but we had to take ACT. The deal with ACT is its scoring is very different. English, math, reading, science, so 36 points total. It's at least a 2 on each section. So I believe the lowest you can get total is probably 8. And like with SAT, it's hard to answer what's a good score. It depends on where you're starting, what your goals are. So what happens is you average the 4 sections, you divide by 4, and then round up. So if it's 25.5, you're at a 26. If it's 25.25, you're at a 25. 26 is just a 26. So we'll talk a little bit about scoring and super scoring, but just a very different scale here. Still graded on a curve, still standardized, but perfect is 36. It always goes in this order: English, math, reading, science. You see 75 questions, 45 minutes on English. Fast paced, but it's easier. And that's the theme with ACT is it's all fast paced, but it's all a little bit simpler. 60 minutes for 60 questions, but you get your calculator the whole time. They're all multiple choice, but there are 5 choices rather than 4. That's a big difference. No grid-ins though. We'll talk about what's on there. And then reading, very fast pace. More questions than minutes. Same with science, more questions than minutes. So you really have to go quickly. The whole test is about 3 hours if you don't have extended time. SAT you register for on SAT.org, ACT is ACT.org. And it tests a lot of the same stuff. But you'll notice in math, that's the big difference, I think, is there's a ton of geometry. And some trig, actually not that small amount of trig, probably 4 or 5 questions at least. Still algebra, still arithmetic, but just heavier on geometry. ACT is you need to know a little bit about a lot. SAT is you need to know a lot about a little. We've got reading, we've got vocab, and we've got graphs, of course. Overall, really got to pace yourself quickly. So quality over quantity, meaning make sure you can get the questions you know you can get. The other thing I see a lot of is people think they've gotten most of these right because they're moving quickly, but then they've actually solved for the wrong thing, right? Or they put a Y in instead of X. So always, of course, circle what you're solving for. But the real lesson here is go quickly, skip things that are tough, don't spend too long on anything, right? Be ready to just move past it and preserve momentum and confidence. For grammar, we're going to fly through this because it's the same. The big difference is faster paced and easier, but honestly, there's almost no difference between SAT writing and ACT English. So what we've got here is subject-verb agreement. I mean, this is an example we didn't see on the last one. Over the misty mountaintops glide the majestic gray eagle. I would tell my students to see, oh, A and C are both present tense verbs. So this is probably not testing tense, it's probably subject-verb agreement. One of those is usually right. We just have to figure out what the subject is. Here, the eagle is the subject after the verb, which is weird. So you'd say glides. It's strange to say mountaintops glides, but it's okay because the subject is the singular eagle. Over the mountaintops glides the eagle. And what's strange about verbs is singular verbs have an S at the end, right? He plays, they play. ING verbs on this test are usually wrong because they're not real verbs, right? If I just say he is gliding, he was gliding, then it's a verb. But if I just say he gliding, no. So ING, be careful, they're fragment makers and often wrong. I do think this is a pro tip though. Use the choices. Honestly, I can't say it enough. Treasure the answer choices and use them to work backwards and think about what the writers are trying to get you to see. That's huge. We've seen examples already, so I think we can just go past this. But again, we've got commas, punctuation, clauses in general. All three of these would be grammar. On number 3, because of the comma after short-lived, we need another comma after away. Versus number 2, we can get away with only one comma. When in doubt, cut it out. We like that. All right, moving on. For rhetoric, just like on the ACT English, we want context. So these are where you haven't really read on the left. So you go on the right and then you stop and say, okay, I need to figure out before and after if it flows well. So the job here would be pick yes or no first. Yes, if it flows and it stays on topic. No, if it doesn't. The hard part here, especially for bright students, is not to overanalyze, right? It'd be to look and just say, what are they trying to get me to see? And then decide on a very basic level, yes or no. No blurs the focus would usually be a right no answer, and transitions would often be a good yes answer. We saw this one already, so accomplished tasks will come up on ACT. Math, though, very different. So again, calculators, yes. Formulas, no, and you might wish you had them. It's a grab bag. So again, you need to know a little bit about a lot, meaning they might just say, hey, do you know what a logarithm is? Here's a point. Ever seen vectors? There's another point. Do you know what an ellipse is, or equation of a circle in the coordinate plane? Point, point, point. And then for any one of those that you're like, shoot, I haven't done this in a while, I don't remember, we're hard pressed. You might have to just kind of finagle a guess or move on. So ACT is really about just remembering everything you've ever seen in math on a very basic level. Some people are fine with that. Others don't like this part of ACT. And it's very fast paced, 60 questions, 60 minutes. So 60 seconds per question. Because they get harder as they go, ideally it'd be like spend 10 minutes on the first 20 and then 20 minutes on the next 20, and you've got 30 minutes on the last 20, because the last 10 or 20 questions will be the hardest usually. Content-wise, you can see that much, much bigger percentage of geometry. So it's still almost half algebra, but a lot of geometry, a decent amount of arithmetic, and at least 7% trig, which is kind of melded into some of this other stuff too with geometry. And again, most of that's the basics, 180 degrees on a line, remembering absolute values, SOHCAHTOA. Math strategy is always the same though. It's answer what we're actually asking for, translate, write out your work, use your calculator. Again, graph stuff on the calculator. You can do a lot. You can change decimals into fractions with the math button. You can create matrices. There's a lot of things people can do that they don't know they can do. And then, yeah, if you've got time, check your answer. We often won't have time. 29 is an example of an ACT math problem that I've seen a decent amount, both of these, but especially 29. And they're literally just saying, hey, have you learned SOHCAHTOA? If so, you know, TOA means opposite over adjacent. And so tangent of A would just be A over C, interchoice, or sorry, A over B, interchoice A, opposite over adjacent. So those are the things that you don't have to memorize on SAT, you just have to know they exist, versus ACT, you would actually have to know them to solve a lot of these questions. And I try to not burden students with too much to memorize. I feel like it's hard to do that. So the more you can kind of keep just as, if I see this, I know what to do, and having these triggers, the better. I'd rather not have to memorize a bunch of stuff. Another example here. For a right triangle question, they're asking for the height of the right triangle. Generally, right triangles mean Pythagoras. If it's a special right triangle, fine. This actually is, but it's a little bit of a weird one. So in this case, we would just translate into a squared plus b squared is c squared, understanding that the hypotenuse is the c, the 26. So 24 squared plus b squared is 26 squared. We find b squared is 100 or b is 10. This is actually a multiple of the 5, 12, 13 triangle, which could save a tiny bit of time and effort. I'm not as big on that because I feel like it won't take long to do Pythagoras. So if people are struggling to memorize the 5, 12, 13, don't sweat it. That's not something to dwell on. Here's a probability question. It's changing probability. In the interest of time, we'll move a little bit more quickly, but this is the type of stuff we would do in a tutoring session. The hard part here is because cashews are being added, we should actually focus on the other stuff. The macadamias and the peanuts, there's 27 of those. There will always be 27 of those. And if cashew has to end up 2/5, macadamias and peanuts have to be 3/5. So we can take those 27 over X, the final total, set that equal to 3/5, cross multiply to figure out the total, meaning we would have to add 5 cashews to get 45 total nuts. That probably is leaving some of you feeling, okay, I don't get that because you moved too fast. That's okay. I'm sorry about that. Just want to make sure you get to the rest of the reading and science. Speaking of which, reading is always in the same order for ACT. So it's not like SAT where it flips a bit. There are no super old passages. So if you find reading to be a weakness, ACT sometimes is a good test, but it's so fast paced. So we have time to like spend maybe 2 to 3 to maximum 4 minutes reading. And then that leaves you with 4, 5, or 6 minutes on questions. An average of just under 9 minutes to do a passage plus 10 questions. Pretty crazy. So some people need to strategically skip a question here or there intentionally, or move around to passage types they like better. What I mean by that is a lot of people just have no chance of getting to everything. And so you can try just for 3 passages. On the last one, you bubble straight down any letter. Then the maximum you could probably get is about 27 points. But if you nail those 3, that's going to be better than trying to get through everything because you'll miss a bunch. So these are the time constraints based on how much we're planning to get through the test. And again, everyone's different. If people get extended time, ACT reading and science tends to be the place where that's most needed and helpful. So this actually is in order. So prose fiction first, then social science, then humanities, and natural science last. One of those 4 will be a comparison passage, which will have the exact same strategy as SAT comparison. Always in this order though. So predictable and is section 3 on ACT, not section 1 like it is on SAT. Again, an open book test. So the job is read the question and paraphrase it, and then predict the answer if you can, find awful answers with words the writers put in to make them bad, and then try to find a choice that just isn't amazing, but we can't argue with it. That's the main idea, is find something that's like, yep, can't argue with that. That's a perfect reading answer, the least wrong. Here are some common questions you'll see on ACT. So how's it organized? Those are hard questions. Point of view, so the title can be helpful there. Main idea of the passage or a paragraph, often tough. And then specific line reference. They don't have the evidence paired questions, but they do use line reference now and again. And we've talked about the comparison passage. Won't necessarily be harder. Sometimes it's easier, but just making sure that you deal with them in order. Don't do both readings first, passage A, passage B. Do the passage A, then the questions, and then the rest. All right, here we go. Last section is ACT science. We're doing well. We got 10 minutes left, so 5 minutes here, 5 minutes for questions. On the ACT science, you get 35 minutes for 40 questions. And so the general rule that I give people is skim or skip the passage and graphs and go straight to questions and answer choices. The best move here is questions to choices to graphs. And I think most of the science questions can be answered that way, at least 50%, if not more. If there isn't a match, then we go to the passage for context. And then if there's still no match, then you can think like a scientist and use outside knowledge or common sense, but that is rare. It's mostly just matching graphs. So it's not really science at all. It's about, like, again, interpreting figures, titles, axes. How do we demystify? Because that is something I see people needing to do. They give it too much credit. Very much a surface level test. We don't have time to read it, and we don't want to because most of it's unnecessary, and most questions will not ask about the info in the passages. Rule number one is going to be questions and choices. I would add that and match those words to the graphs. I would say, again, most questions are done just like that. You can be finished and confident. And so if there is no match, of course, you'll go back and look. But like here, you get to read about dirt. This will be an example of a science topic and some numbers here. You can mark up tables. So like here, we could see that there is a direct relationship between the particle content of silt and clay and the water content percentage, but that's indirect with sand. So little things like drawing arrows can help show relationships. Oops. Another example would be this, where you can again see a relationship. Again, direct, they're both going up towards the bigger number. Dirt, clouds, biophysics, chemistry, all of it. What do we need? So in the graphs, we need to be able to interpret trends and what can you extrapolate without making an inference. Should not have to think. And then scientific method. How did these experiments differ? What was the independent variable? What was the control? So basic science that sometimes people need to knock a bit of rust off, but have probably done at some point. Some practice questions. We've got time to do this one, so I'll leave it up here for a moment. And so in this case, we're asked for some star in galaxy B, but first we need to find luminosity of a star in galaxy B with a surface temperature of 3000. So galaxy B 3000, that's right here. The question is, when will it be twice that? Looks like about 3300. Draw that line straight down, close enough. But the lines overlap, you gotta be careful looking at the right thing. So most of this is just at the end of the test, how much energy do you have left and how much attention to detail can you put? This would be a relationships question. The data in figure 3 best support which of the following hypotheses? As the surface temperature increases, the average size does what? And the answers are decrease, increase, or shifting trends. It's not a constant rate, and it kind of goes straight a little bit for a while, but it never goes down. So I go B, no question here, it just goes up. Right, that'd be a fairly simple question, 1 of 40, sure to be followed by something a little bit trickier. Let's finish up with just kind of some housekeeping and basics, the essay portion. So first off, both tests might have a section 5, which is experimental. So if you ever see a section 5, don't panic. It's not real. It's just for data for future tests. It won't count towards your 1600 or your 36. The SAT used to do SAT 2 subject tests for college credit. Now they just do AP exams. So no writing portion on SAT, no subject tests. ACT essay still exists, but it's optional. And there are like 5 schools, which I barely heard of, that require the ACT essay. You should check your list just to make sure, but I'm pretty confident in recommending for most people in ACT, don't worry about it. And for SAT, like I said, it's not even an option. So writing portion has gone by the wayside, which is fine. Kind of wrapping up here. So just telling you a bit about what Applerouth does. Like what I do is the test prep part of this. We also have academic tutoring, so self-help in school or AP exams, which I do a little bit of, and then executive function coaching as well. We've got some great people who work with that. But for me, it's been for years now just online test prep, ACT, SAT, usually 10 or 20 hours spaced out over the course of several months with homework and mock tests and real tests. The first thing you should do though, before you sign up for anything, is just take mock tests. And Applerouth generally gives them this for free or very cheap. And just figuring out which one of these 2 tests is better for you. So decide SAT, ACT, and then pursue one of them, not both. You want to identify one test and take 2 or 3 official tests. But yeah, every student's different. So here's Applerouth's contact info, which I'll put back up in a moment. Some cool things coming up. We've got these webinars on September 7th, 21st, and 28th for parents and for students. See the link there, applerouth.com/academic success to reserve a spot. I've been to a couple of these, they're super cool. And sometimes Jed presents them, Jed Applerouth, other times it's just other all-stars at the company. Another new thing that's really awesome is our writing workshop. So one-on-one tutoring, 5-part curriculum with variation. So we recommend 5 hours, but people have been doing different things. And we haven't been doing a lot of writing because we work with so many independent educational consultants, but this is something we're now offering. It's a very cool thing if writing is something you feel like your student needs to work on specifically. And now we've got just a few minutes. Like I said, I'll get you out of here in 3 or 4, but any questions that you've got? I see a couple here. So one is, do they clear your calculator before taking the test? The answer is no, they don't. The only thing that happens now is proctors walk around during the test to make sure you're using an approved calculator. And almost anything is approved. Unless it's like TI, Inspire, CAS, like it's a computer that makes sounds and connects to the internet, your calculator is probably fine and they won't clear it beforehand or check it. Another question was, so this is a good question. The SAT is changing formats to online adaptive. You don't have to worry about that yet. I think that affects only current freshmen. I think only current 9th graders. But the SAT is changing formats. This is all for the current hard copy tests. They'll be in place for the next couple of years. And then the ACT is also changing online, but we don't know the timeline for that. I have a question about SAT fee waivers, which is, I remember my students used to call them free waivers. It's if you get reduced lunch or free lunch at school or are eligible otherwise for a fee waiver, so you don't have to pay the, whatever it is, 50, 60 bucks to register. In my experience, you are able to get and use up to 2 fee waivers for each test. So you have to look at your counselor, but I think they limit it in College Board as you can do 2 SAT fee waivers and 2 ACT, but not more than that. See if there's any other questions. Looks like we're good. Feel free to reach out to Applerouth. You can request to work with me as the tutor. I work as a premium online tutor, ACT, SAT, and I love this stuff. So ACT, SAT, hope you learned a lot today and hope you have a great rest of the evening. Thanks for joining.